Hello, everyone. Welcome again to another episode of Axis. Today, we will be discussing the impact of U.S. foreign policy endeavors on U.S. elections 2024. Today, our guest is Manahil Ahmad, and she's currently working at the foreign desk editor at Fox News. She has previously worked with Indus News, Hum News in the past. Thank you so much, Manahil, for taking out the time for this episode. I hope we can learn some interesting things about the events that are taking place regarding the elections.
Thank you for having me.
So, Manahil, firstly, why don't you give us a little backdrop or perhaps some ground information on what's really happening right now? What's the sentiment, the pulse of the people with regards to the election cycle that's going to come in 2024, especially in the context of the foreign policy endeavors of the United States. You've got the Ukraine war happening on one end, and on the other end, we have the Israel-Hamas conflict with Palestinians taking the brunt of it.
So what we're seeing in America right now is most probably a rematch between former President Donald Trump and President Joe Biden. We have other Republican candidates as well. We have Nikki Haley, we have Chris Christie, we have Vivek Ramaswamy, and we have Ron DeSantis, who's the governor of Florida. But Donald Trump is leading the polls. I think there was a recent poll by Reuters which suggested that he remains the most popular Republican leader with 61% of support among voters, which is then followed by Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis, which is 11%, which doesn't even come close. And so most probably what we're seeing will be a rematch between Joe Biden and President Donald Trump. But then again, we still have a lot of time to know that for sure. And there are plenty of factors that will be affecting the upcoming elections. There's immigration, there's abortion, there's climate change.
Exactly.
It does remain the most important topic among voters over here. And then, of course, there's the conflict in the Middle East, and then there's the war in Ukraine. So everyone knows what's happening in Palestine. I don't think there's anybody who's not aware of it, and that has majorly impacted how people view Biden in the past 2 months. The Ukraine war has been an ongoing conflict for almost 2 years now. A poll by CBS recently suggested that a lot of Republican voters do not support sending aid to Ukraine. I think there were 65% of voters who were okay with sending aid to Israel, but 45% were okay with sending aid to Ukraine. And even the candidates that we have, of course, the Democratic Party is extremely pro sending aid to Ukraine, sending aid to Israel, this war against Hamas that they call it. But then there's a conflict in the Republican nominees. There's Donald Trump, who went on air and said that he will resolve the Ukraine war in 24 hours. He's also surprisingly not been so vocal in his support for Israel, but then his support for Israel was a cornerstone of his foreign policy in his first term.
Exactly.
The other Republican candidates as well. Vivek Ramaswamy is the only one who's not pro-war. He refuses to support sending aid to Ukraine and Israel. Chris Christie, Nikki Haley are extremely pro sending aid. Chris Christie even visited Israel recently. He also visited Ukraine. And then we have Ron DeSantis, who personally sent medical supplies and cargoes and stuff to Israel to support them and their war against Hamas. So the policy against Ukraine and Israel, you will see a huge difference, not just among the candidates, but among the voter sentiment as well. It's obviously more pro-Israel, and with Ukraine, there's a conflict about how much support they want to show and they don't.
So, Manahil, I'm curious, as you mentioned, when it comes to voter support on these matters, right? So recently we did see quite a few campaigns emerge in places like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Florida, and a few others, talking about the abandoned Biden campaign, but they were not necessarily in support of the Trump administration either. And some of the independent candidates are not showing much regard to what's going on with the Palestinians. As you mentioned, that there's rather more support towards Israel in comparison to that of Ukraine. So, what I want to understand is perhaps if you can guide us a little bit on what sort of response is coming from within the community, like, the migrants, the, multicultural, multi-religious people are currently present in the US. How is that unfolding when it comes to public opinions? How is that likely going to influence, or not at all?
It will be influencing it. I think Palestine was one topic that wasn't such a polarized topic in the United States, but after October 7th, it has extremely become polarized. Just alone in New York, we saw over 500 protests, and that is significant to see that amount of protests in just over two months. Um, and you're right. So you see, we have these swing states. For example, we have Michigan. Michigan is a swing state which elected Donald Trump in 2016, but then Biden did take it back in the past elections. But over 140,000 Arab Muslims in Minnesota did vote for Biden, who now say that they're not going to be supporting Biden at all because of his response to the conflict that's happening in Middle East. Now that is significant because they played a huge role in helping Biden be elected and win that state. So if he loses the support of Arab Muslims, he can lose very important states, Minnesota being one of them. In fact, there was a poll by CNN recently which suggested that Trump is leading Biden in Georgia and in Michigan. So what I think was very, very important is to understand that the power of social media, number one. I think mainstream media channels aren't the only outlet left for people in this country to be getting news. There's social media as well, which is impacting. Plus, a lot of progressive young voters and even people within the Democratic Party have been pushing Biden towards a ceasefire, but he's been extremely reluctant to even use the word ceasefire. Not just him, even more progressive Democratic leaders, Bernie Sanders being one, who's been very vocal about his stance on Israel, and he's spoken in favor of the Palestinian people plenty of times in the past. Even he's been hesitant towards using the word ceasefire. And I think this will play a very important role in the upcoming elections.
So you mentioned social media, and I do have a couple of questions with regards to journalism as well. But before we hop on to that, I mean, we've always seen the United States of America sort of talk about the values-based order. We talk about democratic values, and a lot of people have been making comments that ever since the Capitol attack that happened on Capitol Hill, things haven't been the same with regards to the democratic values of the US. So I want to understand, many people have the fear of the erosion of democracy. So if you could comment on what sort of institutions come into play. And my added question to that would be, you talked about social media being, the second platform where people can consume information. But how does that also influence voter behavior? Because we've also seen a lot of disinformation, campaigns take place. And a lot of times we've seen social media being blamed for a lot of the influence that it has on the potential electoral sort of sway, that we would see.
So, of course, social media, I think what we saw, especially in the conflict in the Middle East, is you did see a lot of mainstream channels sort of change. I wouldn't say change their narrative, but sort of like shift and be a little more truthful in their reporting. That did come from a lot of public pressure that came from all the protests that were happening, that came from all of the videos that were coming up on social media. One cannot deny what is happening in Gaza. It was all these official organizations were coming forward and saying. So you have seen a shift in the type of reporting that, let's say, MSNBC's been doing, or CNN's been doing, or BBC has been doing in the past. A channel as conservative as Fox also did have to speak about the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding in Gaza. So that is something that mainstream channels had to come forward and change about the reporting because of what's happening on social media, what's coming forward. In fact, there's this tremendous reporter in CNN who was the first, Clarissa Ward was the first reporter to independently go into Gaza and sort of highlight the humanitarian crisis that's happening over there. And she did a report, which I thought was absolutely amazing. Um, so yeah, in that way, there's been this positive. I don't even know if I'd call it positive change because it shouldn't be happening in the first place. But yeah, so that I think was the power of social media and the power of the people, because a lot of people came out in the streets. DC saw one of its biggest protests.
Exactly.
In its history. New York has saw so many protests. I mean, London was over 300,000 people came out. Um, I think Paris even banned some protests. Regardless of that, the number of people that came out was just amazing. Um, but that being said, to question democracy, I don't think I personally don't think that will ever be too relevant in the United States of America because it does remain a symbol of a free democracy and a free world, and Americans do have this pride about it. And they do understand the power of it, which is why the upcoming elections will be so important because for communities like Arab Muslims or Muslims in general, or immigrants, they will be using their vote to decide who they want their next leader to be. And there was a poll by the American Institute which said that Biden's support by American Arab Muslims has dropped by almost half of it. So that is when democracy comes in play, and we will see that in the new elections.
It's quite interesting because, as you've mentioned, plenty of the candidates are showing more sort of direction towards supporting Israel rather than talking about the ceasefire itself, and because you get to understand that there is a vivid divide between what perhaps the state is looking into and what the people are seeing and feeling and would like to see. So it boggles one's mind to understand why not a single candidate is able to gauge into that sort of sentiment as well. Is it that unpopular among the people?
No, it's not.
I mean, despite the protest, I don't see a candidate coming forward to chant ceasefire or talk about all the wrongs that have been committed by the Israeli state itself.
But that's just been the American foreign policy for as long as we can remember, right?
Yeah,
In fact, he went as forward to say in one of the Republican debates that America needs Israel. It's not the other way
exactly.
around, you know? Um, you have her saying stuff like that, and then you have Chris Christie saying this is the price we have to pay for being the leader of the free world. So no, but again, that's my point. Like a recent Reuters poll did suggest that 55% of Americans do not support Biden's stance on whatever's happening in the Middle East. They do support a ceasefire. Majority of the Americans, according to a Reuters poll, 55% suggested that a ceasefire is the best way to end this. I think Vivek Ramaswamy is the only candidate who suggested that we shouldn't be sending aid to Israel and instead we should be offering diplomatic help.
Okay.
But then again, the poll suggests that he only has 4% of support among the Republican voters, so he has a long way to go. I'm assuming, but you never know. But that's just the American policy, the American foreign policy. I think the recent UN vote, but public pressure again was the reason why the recent UN vote approved the humanitarian aid entering Gaza, which was absolutely huge step. It was really big. The US abstained, but it abstained so the bill can be passed. It couldn't agree to it, so it decided to abstain. It didn't veto it, which was good enough. And that tells you that the power of democracy, the power of people, public pressure, social media, all of that.
So, Manahil, my next question is obviously an extension of, from what we talked about social media. But, you're in the field yourself. So, my question to you is then, with the election cycles coming in, how is the media coverage and framing of global events during this particular, time period crucial when it comes to, the creation of perception management with regards to who to vote for, who to neglect comes into play? And perhaps a follow up question would be on again on Ukraine and Israel, but I'll come to that later.
See, America is, I think, one of the most polarized countries that I have ever read about. You have the Republican Party, and then you have the Democratic Party, and then the independent candidates are really just there to just sort of decide, who decide the balance between the Democrat and the Republican when it comes to winning a seat. Um, so, and then you have channels like Fox, which is more conservative, and then you have channels like MSNBC, which is more towards the liberal side. So that polarization remains among news channels as well. For example, whatever's happening with Hunter Biden right now, you'll see it being extremely highlighted by Fox News, or you'll see the Trump cases being extremely highlighted by MSNBC or CNN. So that polarization even exists in the mainstream news channels that are in America. At the end of the day, you sort of have to get you are a source of information to the people of this country. That being said, I think there are so many other factors that are influencing the elections. There's abortion, there's climate change, there's immigration.
Exactly.
Even liberal cities like New York and California, they've been having a huge migrant crisis where there are a lot of illegal immigrants coming in from the Mexico border. So that is something they also need to highlight. And the economy being the most important.
Exactly.
So there are other factors that are influencing the elections that are probably more than the conflict in the Middle East and in Ukraine. So definitely, like these are issues that are being talked about on almost every news channel in America. That will be the focus. It remains focused. These are topics that have stayed relevant in all Republican debates. We've had three so far, and these topics have remained strong. So polarization exists, and it's going to keep existing. That I think it comes naturally with a two-party system as well. But what's surprising is that majority of the Americans do not want a rematch between Trump and Biden. They want another candidate. They don't want, because this was exactly what happened in the previous elections as well. You're seeing a rematch between the two of them, and majority of the Americans, and several polls by NBC, by CBS, by Reuters suggest that Americans do not want to see a rematch between Trump and Biden. So let's see.
Well, let's see someone emerges in the middle to sort of add to the challenge for these two. But I also want to sort of understand from your experience and like other experiences from other journalists. Given at this time, we understand that the bilateral relationship of the United States of America with Israel is quite different. From what it has with Ukraine. Regardless, United States is one of the biggest sort of supporter of aid or ammunition when it comes to Ukraine's support in the region, and we're also seeing that for Israel. So, what I want to understand then is that, in your opinion, how has the bilateral relationship between these two countries and the US have sort of impacted the access of information to journalists themselves, the coverage of Ukraine versus the coverage of what's going on in Gaza? Can we assume a nature of censorship emerging on either end? Or perhaps could you draw a comparative analysis of Ukraine and Palestine's coverage with regards to the bilateral relationship?
It's always been so tricky to cover the Israeli conflict because when you speak against Israel, there's always this undertone narrative that comes with it that, oh, when you're speaking against Israel, you're speaking against the Jewish people, you're speaking against a religion, you're speaking against an ethnicity, you're being anti-Semitic. And I think they've played with this so much that it really, really complicates the way you cover the conflict. Um, I've always said this that being anti-Israel does not mean you're being anti-Semitic. But unfortunately, that is something that can very easily be played on over here, especially in the West. Um, you said you talked about Ukraine, and I do think that America's stance on Ukraine and Israel so far has been the same. You know, in terms of the Democratic Party, the support for Ukraine is as much as their support is for Israel, and you see that by the amount of funding and aid the U.S. has given to Ukraine in the past. Recently, we weren't able to pass a bill in the Senate because Republicans just don't think that we need to be sending that much money to Ukraine anymore. They still feel some sort of connection with Israel. Um, Religion plays a huge role. There are a lot of Christians, evangelical Christians, who support um, the Jewish control over Jerusalem. It is the Holy Land. That also plays a role. But with Israel, what you're seeing is the narrative that is over here that it's the only democracy in the Middle East. You
Apparently.
know, apparently, you know. Um, the Arabs are the ones who don't want peace. The Arabs do not understand democracy. There's Jordan, who's not a democracy. There's Egypt, that's not a democracy. There's all these Gulf countries that aren't a democracy. You have Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is at the northern border of Israel, and then you have Hamas, which is at the southern border of Israel. So what you see over here is that, Israel is surrounded by such is surrounded by a hostile environment, and America needs to help Israel to maintain peace in that region. You know, even right now, they have repeatedly said that, they're doing this, that they're protecting civilian life as much as possible, which obviously isn't true. We've seen it quite a few times, but they keep saying that, Israel is the most moral army. In fact, Netanyahu tweeted just yesterday that Israel is the most moral army that exists, and we do everything to protect our civilian population. But there are over 20,000 Palestinians that have been killed, over 50,000 that are wounded. We have over 200 that have been killed just in West Bank, where there is no Hamas. Exactly. But these are that aren't being talked about on mainstream channels and in America. That's where social media plays a role. So like I said, it wasn't till this event that there has been a polarization on the topic of Palestine as well in America. Before this, America wasn't polarized about Palestine at all. I had a colleague that came up to me recently and went like, oh, I didn't realize this conflict has been going on for so long. And we just always looked at it, oh yeah, like there's something happening there again. But in my office, we have like this huge screen which always shows the skyline of Gaza. And 2 months into it, we don't see a skyline anymore because it's flattened.
It has been flattened to, yeah.
Yeah. So, going into work every single day, seeing a skyline of Gaza. And then 2 months later, he was the one who noticed it. He's like, I don't see a skyline anymore. It's just flattened. Like they literally
Obliterated, yes.
But I think it's very eye-opening.
That's interesting because that makes quite sense with how the US foreign policy has been going and what sort of access to information journalists would have on ground versus what is being said on mainstream media. So another question on one of the foreign policy elements with regards to elections would be China. We know that a lot of war games and scenarios have been painted when it comes to China and Taiwan. I understand that the Republicans perhaps would be harsh on that matter and would want funding to move towards combating China in the region. What do you have to say about that? What sort of trends do you foresee with regards to that influencing anyone?
So China, America does always label as one of the biggest enemies, right? But the conflict with China is so much different than what's happening in Ukraine or what's happening in the Middle East, because it's more of an economic war.
Exactly.
Of course, there's Taiwan, and I think what a lot of international political experts were saying that you have a war going on in Ukraine, and then you have the Middle East conflict going on. China might just find its window and be like, oh, the US is so busy in these two places, maybe like, we can do our own thing and sort of like, distract or make whatever uh, relevant election control in Taiwan. So that has been something that Nikki Haley has talked about a lot in her in her debates. She's always talked about China being the biggest threat, but I think among the American people,
Mhm.
um, it doesn't come off as a huge threat, surprisingly. Um, Maybe because they've always seen US foreign policy stuck in a conflict, be it Iraq, be it Afghanistan, be it Syria, be it Ukraine, be it Middle East. So China, even though economically it might be America's biggest rival,
Mhm.
but among the people that just does not it's not that strong as it is among let's say Russia, because right now Russia is um, the oppressor in Ukraine.
I
So
mean,
they look at Russia the oppressor, or they look at Hamas or Hezbollah as these two parties that aren't letting peace survive, but they won't look at China like that because it's not in a conflict as traditional as the other two.
this actually does bring me to the question on, the element of international trade or geoeconomics influencing these particular campaigns of these candidates. Because Trump was quite vocal about his anti China campaign. He was out there talking about how domestic economic issues are essentially, and the cause is China, basically. Essentially, the cause is China for it. So it's quite interesting to learn that that's not one of the prime, perhaps, factors that could potentially influence anyone in this particular area. My last question to you then would be on what you initially also talked about, immigrants who also have some sort of weightage when it comes to the electoral processes. So I want to understand then to what extent do global issues such as climate change and pandemics also influence this? And lastly, how do you think the immigration pattern is going to impact or will be impacted by either of these candidates um, if they win the elections?
So the Republicans, of course, have a more conservative policy when it comes to immigration. Um, Donald Trump is famous for its famous "Let's build the wall." He's been really, really vocal about how he doesn't want illegal immigrants coming in from Mexico. You have Vivek Ramaswamy, who's says that okay, we'll allow you to come through a legal process, but illegal immigrants need to be shown no mercy at all. That's the stance of most conservative
Mm-hmm.
um, uh, candidates, that illegal immigration should be given no mercy. If you want to come, you come through a legal process. And even a lot of Democratic voters do agree with that sentiment.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Earlier this year, the mayor of New York had to announce an emergency because there were too many illegal immigrants that had entered the city. Hotels like five-star hotels had to be booked to cater to these illegal immigrants because there was no other way where you could shelter them. So they were sheltered in hotels in the heart of Manhattan till they could find other shelter places. So that has also been a huge topic among candidates and among presidential nominees that are moving forward. We saw one of the largest number of immigrants coming in. Legal laws, but the amount of numbers coming in from the southern border are huge, and that will remain is a problem, and it is looked at as a problem among most of the American voters. Even a lot of Democrats. There was a recent poll that showed on topics like immigration and immigration being one of them. A lot of Democratic voters do side with the Republican um, point of view. Um, so yeah, it will be one major thing swaying among voters.
I think this 60th election cycle of the United States would be quite interesting. The world is heading towards some turbulent times, not just in terms of conflicts, but also economies, the reshuffling, the decoupling, all of that that's coming together with the technological advancement that's happening, and at the same time we're unable to sort of restrain the conflicts in the region as well. So let's see where it goes. And thank you so much, Manahil, for taking out the time, for giving us some insights on what's happening and what to expect. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us in this episode of Access.